For coming out to the second day of the Anti-Colonialism and its Afterlives conference at the New School for Social Research. I'm very happy to be the moderator of this panel on abolitionism. I have on the left Vanessa E. Thompson, who is an interdisciplinary social scientist. Her scholarship and teaching explores the relation between state violence, racial capitalism, politics of breathing and unbreathing, Black transnational resistances, and abolitionist feminist world-making. She's a professor in the departments of gender studies as well as Black studies and social justice at Queen's University, Toronto. Assistant professor, and assistant professor at Kingston. Okay, sorry for that. She's the co-author or editor of an edited volume on the most crucial text of abolitionist thought in German, which is called Abolitionismus ein Reader, and she edited that with Daniel Lloyd. And her forthcoming book is called Black Socialities, Urban Resistance, and the Struggle Beyond Recognition in Paris. On my right, I have Vincent Lloyd, who works on political theology and African American religious thought. His research focuses on questions about the intersection of religious and political ideas using interdisciplinary methods. He is a professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University in Pennsylvania and the director of the Villanova Political Theology Project. He's the author of many books, first Black Natural Law, then Religion of the Field, Negro on Black Secularism and Black Theology, In Defense of Charisma, Black Dignity, The Struggle Against Domination, and together with Joshua Doubler, Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons, including Race and Secularism in America. We will start with Vanessa.
Thank you so much for this kind of introduction. And thank you everyone for coming out so early on a Sunday morning. And thank you for the invitation and for organizing this important conference, especially to Jochen, Carlos, Luis, and Udeepta. Yesterday was already really inspiring and thought-provoking, so I'm really looking forward to today's sessions. However, I must confess that I'm also a bit nervous, speaking alongside so many great scholars and colleagues whose work I admire and am inspired by. I also want to express my solidarity and gratitude to the protesters and solidarity with Palestinian people, especially students who are reactivating and breathing life into internationalism in this very moment. Free Palestine, free Haiti, free Congo, free Sudan, free them all. The title of this conference, Surplus People of the World Unite, Conjunctures of Abolition and Horizons of Internationalism from Below, points to the renewing and rethinking of anti-colonialism and its afterlives, a much-needed project also when it comes to abolition. As many of you know, abolitionist politics have gained much political and scholarly attention in the midst of the global Black rebellion in 2020. A rebellion that sparked the streets in the US, Turtle Island, more broadly Europe, the African continent, and parts of Asia. Abolitionist movements struggling against, but not limited to, policing, borders, and prisons have thus entered into a new cycle of struggle in the last years. Through fostering transnational coalitions and further connecting border, prison, and police abolition, and I think it's more than obvious how this is related to the imperial military-industrial complex as well, they engage abolitionist politics. So standing in the tradition of radical abolitionism, ranging from the Haitian Revolution to Quilombo formations, to slave revolts and the solidarity of white workers in the European metropoles, if you think, for instance, of the Lancashire mill workers' strike, and ranging to what the great Black communist and abolitionist W.E. Du Bois called the general strike in the south of the US during the Civil War, all waged by enslaved workers, and thereby as a crucial moment of class struggle, newer formations of radical abolition stand in this tradition. At the same time, we are confronted today with very different conjunctures of global capitalism, especially against a background of neoliberal globalization, automation, and shifting modes of accumulation. This is why we also have to be cautious when we, for instance, engage in discussions around continuities, including colonial continuities. At this neoliberal authoritarian conjuncture, I argue, alongside many others, that questions of surplus, alongside super-exploitation, have moved to the center of struggle, and this demands a reformulation of the relation between abolition and class struggle as well. It is this reformulation that I will focus on in this talk. Although the creation of a relative surplus population is system immanent to capitalism, as only when the supply of labor power is higher than the demand is it possible to force down wage rate, allowing capital to generate profit, the so-called industrial reserve army is no longer needed in the same way in this phase of neoliberal racial capitalism and its modes of automation and financial extraction. So against the background of increasing productivity and the tendency towards technological progress, ever larger segments of the relative surplus population are becoming redundant for capital. Marx's definition of a relative surplus population entails three modes: the floating reserve, employed in periods of economic upswing, the latent part, that segment of the population not yet fully integrated into capitalist production, and the stagnant part, which consists of marginalized people with extremely irregular employment. As Aaron Benanaf shows in his study, A Global History of Unemployment, Surplus Populations in the World Economy, de-urbanization, deindustrialization, and automation have generated an ever larger global surplus population. So in 2015, it encompasses 1.3 billion people, that is approximately 40% of the global workforce. So when I refer to surplus populations in the following, I do not mean people being superfluous in terms of deserving to live, or in a kind of Malthusian sense, being not deserving to live or have no right to life, but in the sense of representing a relative surplus population in relation to the demand for labor power in production. Police, borders, and militarism are the methods to control, contain, concentrate, and manage these populations, including lethal methods. Against this background, we must understand conjunctures of contemporary abolitionist struggle as class struggle of relative surplus populations, the resistance of precarious, wages people, and people rendered disposable and surplus, the fastest growing class on the planet, as Mike Davis argued in Planet of Slums. So in the first part of this talk, I will flesh out a conjunctural shift. So it's like a historical snapshot of the function and role of police as a method of global capitalism. In the second part, I delve into the relation between relative surplus populations, crisis, and class struggle by also engaging with anti-colonial reflections on the role of relative surplus populations or the reserve army. And in the third part and final part, I discuss accounts of surplus people struggles that also challenge more conventional understandings of class struggle. These abolitionist practices and geographies also point to newer forms of internationalism. Policing as a method for the fabrication of capitalist relations. Historically, police or policing understood as a practice of criminalization and control, so not just the institution that you know with officers, like it emerged in the 18th century, developed to activate, protect, and ensure the sovereignty of state authority through violence and coercive force. Policing furthermore played a crucial role in the creation and fabrication of racial capitalist relations and the control and management of the mobility of labor power. The birth of police power, as Mark Neocleous states, dates back to the long array of so-called originary accumulation emerged with the collapse of feudalism in Europe. So policing, or Polizei, as it emerged in the late 15th century in French Burgundia and then spread across Central Europe, focused at the beginning on the administrative and legislative regulation of society to promote good order, which actually means controlling the masses to maintain dominant order, thereby encompassing a wide range of heterogeneous activities such as the determination of food prices, public health, medical care, and welfare. Against the background of the crisis of the feudal mode of production and the political and economic oppression of the lords over the serfs, a result of many factors ranging from the massive depopulation following the plague, the mobility of labor, famines, and the weakening of the estates-based social order, also enhanced through the many farmers' uprisings, new modes of state power emerged alongside the violent separation from the majority of people and their means of production. This violent separation from the land and the privatization of the means of production created masses of landless people who were forced to find alternative means of survival, often regulated to begging and vagabondage, and increased dependence on paid employment. So police regulations emerged to control these social disorders with a specific focus on enforcing and fashioning recruitment into an active workforce, and I quote Neocleos, to accelerate the accumulation of capital by increasing the degree of exploitation of labor, end of quote. Further, besides the labor laws, the criminalization of vagabondage to control the mobility of labor forces, and yesterday we talked about migration as a control of labor with regards to migrant labor. So vagabondage laws were actually there or put in place to control the mobility of labor forces expressed in the Vagrancy Acts, and that was crucial to police methods. As Mark Neocleos argues, police has been, and I quote, central, not just to the repression of the working class and the reproduction of order, but to the fabrication of that order itself. These forms of fabrication have been shaped by racial practices within Europe and before the development of biologistic racism in the 18th centuries. Borders, as shifting and flexible regimes of practices, institutions, and discourses that organize immobility, labor, and the hierarchization of exploitation of mobile labor forces, was similarly essential to the reproduction of capitalism, as borders and their technologies, such as passports, controlled the movement of labor forces. In fact, the control and governance of mobile labor force is crucial for all projects of domination and exploitation. So if you think of how the feudal lords restrained serfs to their land, if you think of European projects of internal and external enslavement and mass deportation to exploit forced and unfree labor, or if you think of various forms of colonialism and the control of land and colonized populations, or the management of temporary labor migration, often from the colonies or peripheries after the Second World War. While policing as one of the central forces of the bourgeois social order was indeed central in the fabrication of wage-labor relations and the administration of poverty, it is thus important to note that its activating force of recruitment into the workforce was not homogeneous but rather differential, within as well beyond Europe. As many scholars of racial capitalism, as well as scholars who do not necessarily use that term but work on the relation between capitalism and racism, argue, racial practices, or what some call proto-racism, were used by those in power to not only rationalize and legitimize domination, but to mediate and structure hierarchized modes of domination, exploitation, dispossession, and violence, thus without an explicit reference to race itself. In Europe, especially Roma, Jewish, and migrant labor was controlled and heavily stigmatized, and specific regulations were passed to especially exclude and criminalize Roma people, to prevent alternative modes of survivals, which were then criminalized, like, begging, forms of sex work, mobility. In early modern Europe, for instance, so-called vagabondage was criminalized to not only force people into wage labor, but also to make them stay put. This affected especially Roma people who have been criminalized and brutalized in Europe for centuries. Genealogies of often explicit racial passport technologies, such as the Gypsy register, provide earlier records of attempts to circumscribe racialized superexploited people's mobility as part of the projects of dehumanization and exploitation. So differential forms of labor exploitation and dehumanization throughout the history of capitalism were thus operationalized through police and border power. As wage labor was not the only outcome of so-called originary accumulation, rather, exploitation has many levels, modalities of superexploitation, unfree and less free labor, and so on, that were fundamental for the development and at the same time a result of capitalism. Policing was central for the recruitment into less free and unfree labor relations as well. The racializing modality of policing thus lies in this unevenness of exploitation and violence, not in the simple policing of racialized groups. So policing as an uneven method of racial capitalism shaped the fabrication and segmentation of a class of laborers in Europe before the external project of the colonial slave trade, where policing played an activating role in the development and reproduction of plantation economies as foundational for the development and reproduction of racial capitalism as a world system, through forms of capture, control, and regulation of superexploited Africans, as for instance the management through the slave code shows, on shores and ships, as well as on the plantation in the Caribbean and Americas. Where the superexploitation of labor was ruled through forms of violence rather than through mute compulsion of the wage relation, policing was experimented with, perfected, and also traveled back to the so-called colonial metropoles as a colonial boomerang effect, to refer to Césaire. Policing is characterized by a racialized unevenness or differentiality according to the hierarchization and segmentation of labor exploitation. The specific articulations of policing and borders are contingent to time and space, especially in relation to racial capitalist dynamics that also change through collectivized struggles waged against them. So as abolitionist scholars have long argued, carceral regimes must be analyzed in relation to societal conjunctures through attending to related but distinct social, political, economic, and ideological contradictions that shape a specific period instead of viewing history simple as a series of repeats. So there's even a problem of making this argument of, the prison is the plantation or the policing on the plantation is the policing that we see today. That's actually what a conjunctural abolitionist approach problematizes. Police and bordering processes continue to play an indispensable, albeit shifting role in the reproduction of the racial capitalist social order and the management of labor power. However, against the background of economic processes and the racial capitalist so-called polycrisis, its function and role also underwent crucial shifts. Capital no longer needs living labor as before. And I quote Shivanandan here. Not in the same numbers, in the same place, at the same time. Labor can no longer organize on that basis. It has lost its economic clout and with it whatever political clout it had, whatever determinacy it could exercise in the political realm. What is crucial here is not that the productive forces have altered the balance of dependency between capital and labor, but that they have altered it so radically as to allow capital to free itself of labor and yet hold labor captive. And I'm actually interested in this process of holding labor captive. A crucial shift with regard to policing, also configured against the background of deindustrialization, de-agrarianization, as well as state attacks and counterinsurgency against labor unrest and revolutionary and anti-colonial movements in the 1960s. The birth of the law and order conjuncture is part of the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism. The hegemonic post-war consensus was in crisis, and the coercive measures of the state increased as a form of crisis management against the background of the birth of the neoliberal order. In the classic text, Policing the Crisis, Stuart Hall, Charles Pritchard, Tony Jefferson, John Clark, and Brian Roberts analyzed a moral panic around mugging in 1972 to 1973 as an articulation of a new conjuncture of law and order state policies, Thatcherism and neoliberal globalization. They show that the relatively new racist panic term mugging migrated from the US and focused around an alleged rise in Black youth crime that was perpetuated through the media, police practices, the courts, and society. This moral panic legitimated an intensification of law and order policies and an expansion of carceral policies in the field of migration, race, and crime. However, as Hall and his colleagues argue in their conjunctural analysis, the moral panic around mugging is an expression of a broader conjuncture, I quote, a more deep-seated historical crisis. Thus, the crisis in the post-war period is itself a result of socio-economic motions and forces of capitalism and imperial formation, as well as a response to migrant, anti-colonial, and working-class resistance. Carcerality and the repressive control of migration and racialized core communities became two of the main forms of governing through crime. A newly configured hegemonic project shaped by securitization and carcerality as dominant trends, and that operates through systems of mass social control, repression, and warfare, as what William Robinson calls accumulation by repression, thus represents a response to the ongoing, albeit shifting, multi-crisis. This crisis is a convergence of crises of over-accumulation in wage labor, care and social reproduction, mass structural force displacement, environment and climate, political stability, and the violent legacies of the Cold War geopolitics and more recent imperialist interventions. Ruth Gilmore's groundbreaking analysis on prison expansion in California, including its global ties and manifestation, is especially relevant for the analysis of this conjunctural shift, as mechanisms of criminalization and punishment increasingly function as modes of crisis regulation and fixes of surplus crisis. In Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and a Position in Globalizing California, she shows with great precision and materialist sensibility that the state of California, I quote, used prison expansion provisional to fix the crisis of land, labor, finance, capital, and state capacity to constitute, I quote, a fundamental shift and a geographical solution to socioeconomic problems politically organized by the state, which is itself in the process of radical restructuring, end of quote. William Robinson makes a similar point in his analysis of what he calls the global police state, a concept to identify the emerging character of the global economy and society as a repressive totality with economic, political, and cultural logics. This refers, according to him, to three interrelated dimensions. The first is the omnipresent system of mass social control, repression, and warfare to contain, I quote, the real and the potential rebellion of the global working class and surplus humanity. As the increasing relative surplus humanity cannot be incorporated, the system even turns to more violent forms of containment, and its methods are borders and other containment walls, deportation regimes, mass incarceration and spatial apartheid, state and private surveillance, and criminalization of poor and working classes. The second related notion is that the global economy is more and more based on development of warfare systems, social control and repression as means of making profit, and to continuing to accumulate capital. That's what he calls militarized accumulation or accumulation by repression. And the third notion refers to the expansion of political systems towards rearticulation of fascism. This current moment of authoritarian returns the massive expansion of carcerality and warfare, ranging from severe enlargement of police powers and the repressive management of migration regimes, and increasing warfare politics unfolds within the hegemony crisis of neoliberalism itself. It were especially anti-colonial scholars and scholars of the Black radical tradition who turned to the analysis of relative surplus populations against the background of the neoliberal counteroffensive and the falling demand of labor as a consequence of increasing productivity. As more and more proletarians are excluded from the circles of capital and are forced to survive as informal and/or disposable workers, especially populations in the so-called global south and racialized working class and working poor populations in the global north, which is rather related to structural reasons and not simply because people are black or are brown or, not simply on the basis of race. A conjunctural theory of surplus resistance as abolitionist class struggle becomes ever more important to reconsider internationalist class politics. Attending to the unfoldings of abolition as class war, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, also implies that class struggle can no longer simply be reduced to the struggle of labor in a more classical sense, as those rendered surplus, wageless, and idle do not have the same means, like withdrawing their labor. This is, of course, not a new argument. Anti-colonial theorists such as Fanon or Cabral, for instance, considered the role of the peasantry as well as the so-called lumpen proletariat in the colonies as part of the central forces of class struggle when thinking about class resistance and revolution. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense organized black, brown, as well as white proletariat, if you think of the Rainbow Coalition, around survival pending revolution, self-defense and not primarily labor. In a similar vein, Stuart Hall and his colleagues analyzed the role of the criminalized part of the Black labor force, and I quote, in relation to the Black working class as a whole, and fleshed out the potential of struggle by the wageless subproletariat that could never exclusively organize around the point of production. They argue that due to the structural position of the racialized subproletariat, wageless and chronically unemployed, superexploited, or highly precarious, they have, I quote, a critical political and ideologically significance in terms of growing cohesion, militancy, and capacity for struggle of the class as a whole, end of quote. While Hall and his colleagues highlight that an active process of political transformation and organization was crucial to create this cohesion, we can see that many movements are already bringing forward this militancy and capacity for struggle of the class, and that they do not only challenge the murderous implications of reform or humanitarianism, like better police, humane borders or prisons, better nation states, but also transform more traditional class politics by attending to surplus resistance. This means that they go beyond the organization of labor in forms of strikes or reductive class struggle, as labor exploitation is not the sole societal mechanism through which capital accumulates. These struggles further fight for the whole class, as the condition of the reserve army puts pressure on employed workers and allows capital to increase exploitation and profit. So now I'm going to talk about three accounts of surplus struggle. In France, the Black Vest movement's collective actions can be understood as an account of surplus politics and resistance because they attend to and spring from the growing surplus classes. Inspired by the Yellow Vest movement, the Black Vest consists of several hundred so-called undocumented migrant workers, mainly Black, and focus on the conditions of undocumented racialized workers that occupy the lower strata of the workforce and bear the primary brunt of the expansion of the French carceral state. Some of their interventions include mass public acts such as the occupation of a terminal of the Charles de Gaulle airport in protest of deportations of people rendered illegalized and undocumented migrants. The further protest against the Lager, which is like a camp system, and detention center. Their mobilizations also include struggles against horrific working conditions and union busting, and they organize for labor rights such as permanent contracts and decent wages, as their many protests and strikes in Paris show. On July 12, 2019, the Black Vests occupied the Pantheon in Paris with 700 to 750 people and demanded legalization and end to their super-exploitation, decent work and wages for all, as well as the right to housing for all. On their leaflets distributed at the claiming of the Pantheon, they stated, "We don't just want papers. We want to break the system that also creates undocumented migrants. We must organize actions, occupations, demonstrations, strikes, blockades. We will only win the end of the papers, the end of the prison houses, dignified housing and wages for all, and the destruction of the detention centers by force, against racism and exploitation, for our dignity and our freedom." The Black Vests are not only fighting against borders or policing in a reductive sense, both methods of racial capitalism, but against the capitalist conditions and relations that produce and rely on these methods. They mobilize strikes and blockades of large corporations, thereby connecting the condition of super-exploitation to the production of people rendered surplus. In their demands and organizing against carcerality, against citizenship, and for decent wages for all, we can see a move that actually characterizes many radical migrant workers' activisms as they connect struggles against carcerality with labor struggles from the perspective of the subproletariat, the marginalized and super-exploited sections of the working class, aspects which can't be separated for this segment of the global working class and working poor in the first place. Their emphasis on organizing actions, occupations, demonstrations, strikes, and blockades speak to their multi-approach of surplus resistance, a multitude that opens rather than closes mass mobilizations and the varieties of class struggle. They further wage struggle against what they call the heart of French imperialism and its plundering of Africa, Paris business districts. Suez steals his water, Société Générale steals his money, and finances the pollution of Africa with coal-fired power plants. Thales build the weapons with which they wage war. The same people who destroy our lives over here are waging war over there, are waging war here. The direct emphasis on neocolonialism as well as climate destruction shows that the Black Vests are mobilizing and encompassing abolitionist politics as class politics. In their squads and during their strikes, their blockades and actions, they further organize liminal infrastructures of support and redistribution, similar to what Huey P. Newton called survival pending revolution. Thereby also putting in practice how a different world could look like through practicing it in the here and now, an abolition geography. These forms of abolitionist organizing and struggle present surplus projects of resistance because they attend to the conditions of relative surplus populations, ranging from displacement, criminalization of movement and migration, organized abandonment, and super-exploitation. The struggles are not limited to organizing around wages, but rather encompass the facets of exploitation and violence that surplus populations, often racialized and migrant, but not exclusively, are exposed in this conjuncture of carceral racial capitalism and neo-imperialism. They do not only broaden the vectors of labor struggles, but highlight the multiplicity of class struggle expressed in abolition. When considering the expansion of wagelessness and pauperism, as well as the expansion of carceral techniques, the focus on the resistance of the so-called underclasses and the subproletariat, the ever-growing part of the population rendered surplus, become even more important. As the practices of the Black Vest demonstrates, they kind of, form a multitude of struggles, especially of those people who cannot withdraw their labor and therefore mobilize their bodies to disrupt capitalist infrastructures and flows. That's the reference to blockation and occupation, as well as the operation of its methods, such as bordering and policing. In Berlin, the 2012 Formed Tenants Initiative, Quartier und Co., struggles against evictions, escalating rents in the area of Cottbusser Tor. one of the poorest neighborhoods in Berlin. Impoverishment and precarization of old and retired folks, policing and state repression against refugees, migrants, and poor people in the neoliberal racial capitalist city. In short, against organized abandonment and for radical reorganization of social life. It brings together, through and in struggle, people who have German citizenship, living on welfare, labor migrants, and recently arrived refugees. Their starting method was talking to each other and sharing their stories in various heterogeneous constellations about their conditions and aspirations. When the movement started, they occupied a square in front of the group's social housing complex in Bilde Gecekondu, translated from Turkish, means building overnight, a space platform for protest, social support, organizing, and imagining. One of their major successes was the reintroduction of the rental concept, which prohibits that social rent increases yearly. Related to this mobilization was the struggle against a planned new police station at Prospersatorn, a space where the carceral reorganization of the city unfolds in form of extensive policing of Black migrant and houseless folks in particular, and the policing and management of poor people in general. The composition of this initiative speaks to new forms of coalitions of the material dispossessed and racialized surplus populations in cities, of racial capitalist neoliberal restructuring. The initiative, called Kotti für alle, Kotti for all, mobilizes not on the basis of identity, but on common political abolitionist principles and denominators to unite. Mieten runter, Löhne hoch, Preise deckeln, Polizeiwache über der Aderweltstraße und permanente Videoüberwachung am Kotti verhindern, ein gutes Leben für alle und überall. Kein Mensch ist illegal, gleiche Rechte für alle. Rents down, wages up, cap prices, stop the building of the police department and video surveillance on the Aderweltstraße. A good life for all, everywhere. No one is illegal, equal rights for all, everywhere. The network has joined the organizing around the referendum Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen, a mass effort of networks, groups, and initiatives in Berlin to struggle for the socialization of over 240,000 apartments from Deutsche Wohnen, Vonovia, Achilleus, and Co. by means of a referendum, while simultaneously joining forces to struggle for voting for all. Kotti für alle and Kotti und Co. connect the expansion of policing to the capitalist speculation of the places where they live, work, and play. Socialization is currently emerging as a new ground of struggle for the reorganization of life, from housing to healthcare, mobility, and energy supply, as well as labor struggles. Okay, almost at the end. While these collectives are organizing within Europe, their work is also shaped by transnational dimensions, like the abolitionist work of collectives around detention centers and border regimes on the African continent demonstrate. The movement Refugees in Libya started mass protests in October 2011 when Libyan police and military forces, deeply equipped and trained by EU and Frontex, raided many of the shelters in the Gagalash area in Tripoli, home to many people rendered refugees and migrants. Thousands were detained and brutally beaten. The movement engaged in protests and blockading after the mass raid and issued a manifesto soon thereafter. A page from their manifesto reads, "We are refugees and we live in Libya. We come from South, East, Central and West African countries, the Maghreb region and the Middle East. We are fleeing from civil wars, persecutions, climate change and poverty back in our countries of origin. We were all pushed by circumstances beyond human endurance. We all had left our homes, seeking a second chance for our lives and therefore arrived in Libya. Here we became the hidden workforce of the Libyan economy. We lay bricks and build Libyan houses. We repair and wash Libyan cars. We cultivate and plant fruit and vegetables for Libyan farmers and Libyan dining tables. And we mount satellites on high roofs for the Libyan screens. Apparently this is not enough for Libyan authorities. Our workforce is not enough. They want full control of our bodies and dignity." The movement makes clear that labor exploitation of people-rendered surplus is mediated through brute violence and force. They further show that struggles against exploitation cannot be separated from struggles against the border system and modes of policing. As people-rendered surplus displaced and forced to migrate, their struggles against the border system shows that the border is not only a labor regime, but a regime of premature death of the paupers, who cannot exclusively organize around labor, but literally, by any means necessary, as people-rendered surplus. Linking these struggles transnationally, the movement has grown across different contexts throughout Northern Africa, Western Africa, and across Europe. Refugee in Libya call for the evacuation to lands of safety, the abolition of detention centers and border regimes, for the freedom of movement, the dismantling of neo-imperial externalization of borders, and an end to the exploitation of workers, especially but not exclusively migrants. Through organizing protests and campaigns, refugee support structures, and solidarity marches, the movement draws on transnational mobilization to not only get voices of those rendered surplus heard, but further to contribute to the transnational dimension of abolition. In the last few years, we have witnessed an increase in abolitionist organizing around borders and policing, both methods of racial capitalism. Much of this organizing addresses the struggle and resistance of relatively surplus populations, the wageless, the working poor, the criminalized, and those rendered idle. Against the background of the current stage of racial capitalism, radical organizing can no longer simply be reduced to the struggle of labor in a more classical sense, as those rendered surplus, wages, and idle have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Abolitionists thus in conversation with approaches that emphasize the heterogeneity of class relations and focus on the dehomogenization of the classical proletariat. These surplus multitudes do not simply organize around different forms of labor, but combine economic as well as extra-economic forms of violence and abandonment. Abolitionist surplus struggles draw on, as the Black Vests remind us, the multiplicity of struggle, the revolt, the blockade, the strike, the action, and the subversion. Putting these struggles in transnational relations more strongly and strengthening the connections between the segments of surplusification of those in the warehouses, the criminalized working poor, the jails, prison and detention centers, the borderscapes, the houses, streets, the cobalt mines, the gender textile factories, the surrogacy homes, the abandoned farmlands, the reservations, the concentration camps. Those struggling to save the forests and seas in danger would put into internationalist motion the disruption of the processes of valorization and the possibility of abolition worlds. Thank you.
Thanks to the organizers and fellow participants for giving life to such a productive and timely conference. While others have already justly praised the curatorial abilities of the conveners, I want to draw attention to one particular aspect of their skill. They've brought together colleagues from different disciplinary backgrounds who rarely find themselves having substantive conversations with each other: sociologists, geographers, philosophers, political theorists, historians, and more. My own background is in critical theory, and my research is on religion and politics. My focus is on the US, particularly on the ideas animating Black American political movements. It is from that perspective that I will stretch toward questions of colonialism, which are just beyond my usual intellectual pastures. And I welcome the opportunity to be in dialogue with and learn from you all as I venture out. Let me start with a strong claim. Abolitionism, as it has been embraced and developed over the past 15 years in the US, represents a political orientation that is unlike those we've seen in US social movement landscapes over the last half century. Put another way, the movement to abolish prisons is not just one more on the menu of issues animating social movements in the US in recent years. Rather, the movement to abolish prisons introduces a particular political posture, not just a distinct political goal. That posture has caught on beyond movements working on prison issues. It's adopted by movements working on a host of issues. As I'm sure you've observed, abolitionists transformed from a marker of a particular political position with respect to prisons to the marker of a particular political identity, an identity characterized by a certain political posture. What does that posture entail? Here is how political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal puts it. Quote, abolitionists are, simply put, those beings who look out upon their time and say no. They want to abolish state policies that they cannot abide. Slavery, mass incarceration, the death penalty, juvenile life, solitary confinement, police terrorism. Abu-Jamal is pointing to a few features of abolitionism. First, its commitment to absolute refusal. Abolitionists say no. They do not ask how slavery could be made more comfortable for the enslaved. They do not romanticize Scandinavian prisons where there are doors instead of bars and mattresses that are thicker, prisons that are still filled with disproportionately poor, disproportionately Black and brown folks. Abolitionists are not reformers. Their singular response to a problematic institution is to shut it down. Second, Abu-Jamal is pointing to the temporality of the abolitionists. They call for immediate action. Their no does not mean no eventually, it means no now. not one more day of slavery, not one more day of human caging. The refusal entailed by abolitionism is not only absolute, but urgent. Third, Abu Jamal is calling our attention to the changing objects of abolitionism. Once, abolitionists refused slavery. Today, they refuse prisons. As Abu Jamal suggests, movements also take up the abolitionist posture with respect to the death penalty and policing. There is a tradition of abolitionism from which contemporary abolitionists can take inspiration, complete with exemplary figures, values, affects, and strategies. There's also continuity in the abolitionist formula of absolute, urgent refusal of a certain institution, and implicit in Abu Jamal's words, there must be practices for judging what counts as an appropriate object of abolitionism. Abu Jamal himself represents a link between two political moments. Born in Philadelphia, he joined the Black Panther Party in 1968. He changed his name to Mumia in honor of Kenyan revolutionaries. He was incarcerated for a murder he maintains he did not commit in 1981 and was sentenced to death. While in prison, he has been a leading voice as both activist and intellectual, developing abolitionist movements. In short, the abolitionist political posture Abu Jamal represents today is closely related to the Black and anti-colonial political posture he grew into in the late 1960s and 1970s. Here I'm hinting at the question I want to explore this morning. To what extent is it useful to think of anti-colonialism as entailing an abolitionist posture? Before addressing that issue directly, let me continue with my potted history. I want to suggest that for those 30-something or so years in between, from the mid-1970s to the late 2000s, the abolitionist posture was dormant in the US. During the long 2010s, it began to reemerge. By the long 2010s, I mean the period from the 2008 financial crisis to two events of 2020, the pandemic and the massive Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd. During the long 2020s, the US saw an upsurge of social movement energy, unlike anything it had seen in previous decades. From Occupy Wall Street to Standing Rock to Me Too, to climate protest, to undocumented youth organizing, to prison abolition, to socialist electoral politics, to Black Lives Matter, masses of people in the US engaged in grassroots political advocacy. All this social movement organizing, all this social movement energy was happening against the background of rapidly shifting attitudes toward electoral politics. The election of the first Black president did not end anti-Black racism, and it did little for the poor and marginalized more generally. Then the choice between a neoliberal and an authoritarian in 2016 further eroded hope in national electoral politics as a site for addressing questions of justice. And those questions of justice were felt all the more urgently, even existentially, as the vulnerability of Black and poor communities and women became increasingly visible through technological change, and the vulnerability of everyone became unavoidable as the climate warmed and the pandemic hit. Again, my suggestion is that the social movements of the long 2010s were qualitatively, not quantitatively, different from years past. When the stakes are existential, when the state is enabling violence on me and my family and my community and on the planet, we ought to act decisively and urgently. Hence, the abolitionist posture emerges from its particular location within the anti-prison movement, spreading across movements, providing a common grammar, a common posture. Let me reflect for a moment on the distinctiveness of the abolitionist posture by comparing it to other political postures. I'm carefully using the language of posture here to bracket questions of content, a question I will think through a little later. The abolitionist stands in contrast to the pragmatist, who looks for the most effective way to push and pull political institutions in the direction of her ideals. She also stands in contrast to the systematician, who has a specific vision of a particular political configuration and insists on pushing the world in that direction. Finally, the abolitionist stands in contrast to a dialectical political posture that would see political contest over any particular issue as one step in a back and forth dance transforming the world in the direction of freedom or justice. In contrast to these alternatives, the abolitionist has a certain clarity that can seem absolutist. When we encounter slavery or human caging, the abolitionist says, we must do everything we can to end it now, not through pragmatic calculations or or because it is incompatible with a broader vision of just institutions, and not because engaging slavery or prisons is one step in a dialectic. Slavery and human caging must end because they are abominations, and the abolitionist thinks abominations must be addressed clearly, urgently, and decisively. Abolitionist theorists often fill out their position beyond this basic stance. They have to account for what makes an institution an appropriate target for abolition. If slavery is a paradigm for abolitionism, then appropriate targets for abolitionism are institutions that have the same structure as slavery. That could be elaborated in various ways, depending on broader theoretical commitments. It could have to do with domination or exploitation, for example. So the abolitionist position could be something like, when we encounter an institution that involves domination, arbitrary rule, it must be abolished. We could offer an account of the prison that shows how arbitrary rule is at its essence, is at the prison's essence, therefore, how it is an appropriate target of abolition. But couldn't this extension of abolitionism get out of control? Surely domination and exploitation are everywhere, but we cannot abolish everything. Abolitionists respond to this concern by asking, why can't we abolish all domination and exploitation? Isn't that a reasonable way to think about political aims? Moreover, we ought to end all domination and exploitation decisively and urgently. Even if it's difficult, we ought to work on imagining a world without domination and exploitation, perhaps through the use of art or song or speculative fiction. Indeed, as Angela Davis emphasizes, this is the affirmative face of abolitionism, the yes that complements the decisive no, a yes to a new world that requires collective imagining and collective organizing. The challenge for the abolitionist, then, is telling a story about a particular practice or institution that calls attention to its entanglement with domination or exploitation, and that starkly contrasts with the imagined world free of domination and exploitation. This is what prison abolitionists do, filling out a story of the prison's ill treatment of individuals and its race, class, and gender-based effects, while also imagining new forms of addressing harms. In other words, the challenge for the abolitionist is not that her view applies too broadly, but that she must have sufficient capacity for judgment to apply the abolitionist vision to the world. I imagine by this point you can see where I'm going. It strikes me that there is a deep resonance between the abolitionist posture and the anti-colonial posture a half century earlier, and in the case of the abolition of slavery, a century before that. There is an institution, colonialism, that is deeply entangled with domination and exploitation. Indeed, that is almost as much a paradigm of domination and exploitation as slavery. The fitting response is not to explore the options on the table, propose compromises, and envision a gradual path toward colonialism's end. The fitting response, from the anti-colonial perspective, is to end colonialism immediately and decisively. At the same time, conjuring a vision of a world without colonialism in an imaginative register, or equally imaginatively, a world before colonialism, motivates and guides a struggle against colonialism. That this posture has receded from discussion about colonialism with the rise of certain strands of post-colonial theory is, in part, the motivation for this conference, as I understand it. In what follows, I want to pursue the apparent similarity between abolitionism and anti-colonialism, first by reflecting on the concept of destruction, which is seemingly at the heart of both, and then by briefly exploring these themes in the work of Amilcar Cabral. I turn to the concept of destruction as a tool to bridge the discourse on abolitionism with the discourse on anti-colonialism, but also as a critical tool to theorize both. Abolitionism is clearly about destroying something, about destroying the institution of the prison, not reforming it, not transforming it. From the abolitionist perspective, the prison must cease to be. If it reappears under a new guise, we have a problem. The same is true for colonialism. In a book and a series of articles, Gila Nidjar has constructed something like a philosophy of destruction. He points out that, surprisingly, destruction is rarely conceptualized. Philosophers and theorists tend to be interested in possibility, capacity, world-making, and lines of flight, rather than in destruction. Those who might seem to come closest to theorizing destruction end up doing just the opposite. Deconstructionists are essentially committed to the impossibility of destruction. Institutions, practices, and discourses never cease to be, on their view. Every attempt to turn away results in a return. And Nietzsche turns to a series of writers who have touched on destruction in order to explore its shape and flavor. Writers such as Walter Benjamin, Martin Heidegger, Sigmund Freud on Death Drive, and surprisingly certain moments in the thought of Jacques Derrida. And Nietzsche argues that destruction must not be confused with violence. Instead of giving the term violence ever more expansive meanings, like the slow violence of environmental devastation, Nietzsche suggests that it is more fitting to invoke destruction. Plastic in the ocean is destroying the world. That is clear, and much less of a stretch than to see the probabilities of disease it increases as something like violence. On Nietzsche's account, destruction does not have a history. History writing is a mode of storytelling about what happens, about action, events, production. Destruction is about what eludes history, what cannot be written because it is no more. And in Nietzsche's reading, Benjamin argues that destruction, quote, clears away the traces of its own undoing, the traces of destruction. In this way, creation and destruction coexist, but they follow different temporalities, one legible to the historian, the other which eludes her. There is thus no way to directly reflect on destruction or to redeem destruction. To encounter destruction requires a kind of trust, a kind of faith. Benjamin calls destruction divine. And Nietzsche's reflections meander into abstraction, but they remain evocative and, I think, generative as a framework for understanding the spirit, as it were, of abolitionism. Specifically, reflecting on the concept of destruction raises three conceptual knots that abolitionists, and I'm suggesting anti-colonial thinkers, must address. First, in the political register, the deconstructionist temptation is felt acutely. It is a temptation to reformism. You don't like prisons, then tell us how you would like to improve them. You don't like colonialism, what additional resources can we provide to make it kinder and gentler? That an institution could be utterly annihilated is simply not on the horizon of possibility. That horizon, after all, is about possibility, about new activity, new energy. Destruction is simply not legible. Second, there is a deep temptation to avoid looking squarely at destruction. If it is not redescribed as deconstruction, that is, reform, then it is read as hyperbole. Surely it could not be the case that prison abolitionists literally want to close every prison. Surely it could not be the case that anti-colonial activists want to fully sever colonial entanglements. Surely such language must be expressing frustration, perhaps righteous indignation, and opening for negotiation. But the abolitionist posture is to think the unthinkable, to insist on it with a kind of faith. Third, at a conceptual level, destruction does not have a moral valence. It is neither good nor bad, just nor unjust. This is a tricky thing about the politics of destruction, about abolitionism and anti-colonialism. They attempt to effect a sort of reversal or mirroring. From above, from the powers that be, there is a will to destruction, to cage and kill black and brown life, to dominate and exploit and kill the colonized. Not quite kill in most cases, rather to make vulnerable to death. And capturing that is precisely why the language destruction offers an advantage over looser language of violence. In the face of destruction, the abolitionist decides to destroy rather than be destroyed. The colonized decides to destroy colonialism rather than herself be destroyed by it. While I'm no expert on anti-colonial thought, and it is quite intimidating to dabble in it, given all the expertise assembled here in this room, I do want to try out this theorizing of destruction in dialogue with an anti-colonial thinker. Guinean organizer and theorist Amilcar Cabral is a particularly useful conversation partner because he captures the spirit of the 1960s anti-colonial moment, and he explicitly wrestles with the concept of destruction. In one of his 1969 speeches to party cadre, Cabral asserted, quote, "Every struggle has two aspects that should always be held together, destruction and construction. We have to destroy the Portuguese state, and we have to destroy the political ideas that the colonists put in our people's heads, and we have to destroy or surpass the political misconceptions that might exist in the heads of our people, in the classes and ethnic groups." At the same time, Cabral suggests the party must be committed to construction, to developing a new way of living together based on freedom and democracy, a new political system, as well as new consciousness in the people. Here is the abolitionist posture put starkly, a negative coupled with an affirmative. No to the colonial state and all its tentacles, institutional and ideological. Yes to imagining new forms of life. Throughout Cabral's writing and political practice, we get a sense of the urgency animating his action. Portuguese rule must not continue another day, even if what will come after Portuguese rule can only be described in poetry rather than prose, as it were. Cabral, after all, is engaged in armed struggle, but he also licenses destruction more generally, for Portuguese possessions make possible Portuguese rule. Quote, we should seek to destroy the economic means of the enemy, their cars, factories, storehouses, depositories, ships, and roads, in order to completely cut off their economic exploitation of the land. While it may at first sound as if Cabral is reversing or mirroring the logic of destruction directed at him, directed at the colonized, he puts forward a rather more complex view. According to Cabral, colonial domination at times aimed at destruction of individuals, of indigenous institutions, of forms of life, but it was never successful. What he calls, quote, the indestructible character of the cultural resistance of the people, quote, made it so that destruction was thwarted. Colonial rule is only stable if it dissolves the ties binding together colonized people, according to Cabral, and it endeavors to do so. The result is a continuous push and pull, with those ties stubbornly resisting the Portuguese efforts at destruction. Not only do those ties persist, they also form an important base of resistance to colonization, a starting point to bring about the destruction of Portuguese colonialism. As Cabral puts it, quote, culture weathers every storm until, encouraged by the liberation struggles, it can burst forth again. We can see a similar logic at work in the prison abolition movement. Those who have been incarcerated gain expertise on incarceration, and movements center such expertise in their organizing practice. Indeed, it is important to emphasize here that prison abolition is, in fact, a practice. It can seem like merely a dream or a vision. In fact, US prison abolitionists insist that the picture they conjure of a world without prisons is necessarily tied to concrete forms of political engagement that shrink the prison system. In a 2017 Jacobin article titled, What Abolitionists Do, Dan Berger, Miriam Kaba, and David Stein argue that prison abolitionists are involved in a wide range of political practices addressing both prison conditions and social conditions that funnel people to prisons. They advocate for ending cash bail, block the construction of new prisons, develop alternative ways of resolving conflicts, and improve the infrastructure for healthcare. What they do not do is support expanding prison facilities as a way to ameliorate prison overcrowding, for example. Even when such policies seem ameliorative, prison abolitionists know that growing the prison system is toothpaste you will never get back into the tube. The prison population will surely grow. Similarly, Cabral does not simply advocate destroying cars and factories. He appreciates the complex ways that culture can be mobilized to end colonial rule and envision a new world, but he also appreciates the ways culture is distorted by colonialism. When the newly awakened petty bourgeoisie turns away from its association with Europeans, Cabral suggests, it gravitates toward simplistic notions of identity, defined in ways flattened both by colonial administration and by the distance at which the petty bourgeoisie stands from the popular masses. For Cabral, appeals to identity may be tactically useful, but they must be held lightly. He worries that Pan-Africanism and negritude are most appealing to those at a distance from the realities of anti-colonial struggle. Just as contemporary prison abolitionists in the US refuse the state's way of channeling prison justice conversations in ameliorative and ultimately prison expanding directions, Cabral worries that the colonial state will survive, or survive under a new guise, by setting the terms for self-understanding in the states it governs. In contrast, Cabral talks about the way consciousness and culture unfold through engagement with the particularities of a place and people over time, a process that colonialism attempts to freeze. Drawing on and pushing beyond the Marxist tradition, Cabral argues that those involved in anti-colonial struggle need to be attentive to the contradictions in local culture, as well as the opportunities to forge new unities, not in terms set by the state. Here, Cabral toys with the controversial question of national consciousness, but I read him as doing so in an emphatically tactical voice. While destruction and construction conceptually are distinct and asymmetrical, they are also entwined. One of the theoretical challenges that thinking abolition, destruction, and decolonization together spotlights is the need to develop ways of describing that entanglement that avoid the idiom of deconstruction, a language that ignores the particular clarity and forcefulness that defines destruction. Cabral offers some thoughts in this direction along the lines of the Marxian adage, through struggle we become fit to govern ourselves. For Cabral, the contradictions of culture, particularly those around class complexes and prejudices and ethnic barriers, are worked through in the process of struggling for liberation. The mechanics of struggle, involving analysis, self and collective formation, and risky engagement with forces of domination, loosen and rework the consciousness of those engaged in struggle, opening new possibilities for collective life. In other words, through pursuing destruction, through pursuing the end of colonialism, new individuals and a new world start to come into being, not as a direct result of destruction, but indirectly. In this way, construction and destruction maintain their distinct temporalities and phenomenologies. Now, you might object that I confine myself to the realm of political posture, perhaps a curiosity, but at a great distance from criteria for evaluating the content of political positions or strategies. Indeed, the abolitionist posture, committed to a seemingly unwarranted faith in destruction, might tempt in a quite undemocratic direction, the bottom-up equivalent of Schmidian decisionism, perhaps. But just as Carlos was arguing yesterday that we should read political performance as itself carrying content, I wonder if the same may be true with posture, and if posture and performance may be entwined. The commitment to purging abomination from our world entails affects and acts, forms collectivity, and perhaps points toward democracy. As I near my end, let me zoom forward 50 years to the present. I opened by talking about the vibrant social movement landscape in the US of the long 2010s. And I suggested that 2020 marked a bookend, when the existential stakes were raised to the highest point yet, with a pandemic posing questions of life and death universally, and with Black Lives Matter protests massive, multiracial, and geographically expansive, from coastal cities to small towns and flyover states. I point to 2020 not only because it is a high watermark, but because it marks an endpoint. Since then, the tide has turned. Reactionary forces have captured the mainstream media narrative, and elite interests have captured social movement energy. Had our conference been 2 weeks ago, this would have been my melancholy ending. What we saw ourselves yesterday here at New School, and what we are seeing across campuses in the US, changes my story. The abolitionist posture, which became a live option in the long 2010s, and became almost a default orientation for certain segments of Gen Z, has again been activated in the struggle to end the genocide in Gaza. Once again, abolitionist once again, abolitionism and anti-colonialism come together. The abolitionist posture entails that colonial domination and exploitation must end. The occupation must end urgently, decisively. The appeal of the abolitionist posture is that it does not merely advance a political agenda, it changes a conversation. Triggered by an abomination, the abolitionist posture makes others witnesses to that abomination. At the same time, it conjures a new world, a world where all are free from the river to the sea. Thank you.
Okay, so we have already questions from Andreas, Carlos, and then Vita. Okay. Do you want to bring the microphone?
Thank you for these very two illuminating papers. I have many questions, but I will try to limit them, especially in relation to the second one, but also with the first, because they are in a kind of dialogue, obviously. So it seems to me, Vincent, that you try to, my interpretation, I might be wrong again, you try to address the question of the negativity or the destructive aspect of abolitionism through the comparison with anti-colonialism. In other words, for you, does abolitionism, that the term is negative, emphasize the element of destruction, does it include a dimension of new beginnings, creation within its own theoretical conceptuality or not? So this is the first question, because if it is yes, then there is a second dimension. To go back to Max Weber, the two politics of ultimate conviction and the politics of responsibility. Because if the project is to destroy, how one takes into account implications, consequences, effects that one might not even control, or one might not have even thought about it. So to abolish, does it involves also to think about some unintended consequence, unplanned, that might follow from this act of destruction? The other is, what do we destroy when we want to abolish anything? Do we destroy the symptom, or do we destroy the cause? Because prisons, let's destroy prisons, let's abolish them. But prisons are predicated on a broader socioeconomic, cultural regime. So how far the project goes? So you can abolish some forms of domination. Do you abolish the sources that produce this domination? How deep the destructive project goes? Where it's the bottom? To say that like the traditional communists, to abolish exploitation, we have to abolish capitalism. After that, there is nothing else that is the cause that is given. So this is also a part of the question. Another issue is that I think the idea of abolitionism also comes a little bit close with another new concept that has emerged in the last 2 decades, destituent power, to destitute. But destituent power has a dialectic relationship with constituent power. They're both, you cannot constitute something if you don't destitute what impedes the constitution of the new. So I was wondering whether abolitionism, to go back to my first question, contains this instituting dimension. I need to abolish prisons in order to open up possibilities of a different life, as you mentioned. And my last question is the strategic question, because obviously in the way you present it and in the way that I recognize it, it is a maximalist project. It is a maximal objective, since it's against reformism, repair, or whatever else. So in this maximalist attempt, how it will be measured? Since here we cannot achieve even the most minimal demands. So how we are going, it will be confronted constantly with a failure. a failure after a failure, how that will affect a political project? Maybe the goal is normatively political, opens up new horizons. But if it is unreachable, what kind of politics that will be? A new kind of utopian struggle, or more concrete, more realistic? So these are some, I have many more, but these are a few ones. Thank you both for your presentations.
Again, thank you very much for an immensely stimulating panel. I have, again, a question for each of you. Vanessa, in your case, I'm wondering if it might be useful to work off, T.H. Marshall's old, but I still think very instructive essay on rights and rights making. In the sense that when he spoke of rights, it was always presumed that already the persons that were seeking rights were citizens. I think an important distinction you're making, but it's not fully explicit here in your presentation, is that these are rightless people who are claiming rights. But the paradox is that they're oftentimes claiming rights to at least in your presentation, they're claiming rights or demanding rights to a state. And if that's not the case, maybe you should help us understand who are they claiming to, who is the object of their claims. And again, I do think bouncing off, pivoting off T.H. Marshall may be useful. Vincent, immensely stimulating as well. And I have two questions for you. The first one, could you help us understand, at least my understanding of the Black community in the US and their history? Partly it parallels in some ways the Latin American. We went from liberation theology to other things. In here, my understanding is the Black community began with a redemptive religious understanding, and now you're saying there's been a shift, at least this is the way I understood it, a shift to abolition. Could you tell us what are the continuities and discontinuities, if any, between that shift? And the second question, I think, is in relation to my friend Andreas, and it's the following. The way I heard or understood your talk is that there are actually three types of destructions. There's creative destruction, which would be, in your terms, deconstruction, because, let me backtrack. The three types of destructions that I heard you speak about are related to temporality, and that's the axis. The first one is creative destruction, in which time, in a sense, is the eternal present. And Schumpeter is a little bit of this sort as well, creative destruction. The second one is constructive destruction, in which temporality, there's a disjuncture. And Cabral, the constructive destruction is how I heard you say, there's a temporal disjunction between the two moments. The third one, which I think is not fully elaborated, is destructive destruction. And there, I was a little troubled, and I'll tell you why, because you said destruction is not good or bad. And I couldn't help but think, how would you classify, for example, if we take that destructive destruction as being the eternal present, or the timeless present? So it's unlike deconstruction in that destructive destruction is the timeless present. There, I'm wondering if Gaza would not be an example, and because it's not good or bad, I wonder how you evaluate this particular moment or type of destruction, destructive destruction.
Thank you. I want to thank Vanessa and Vincent. That was such a fantastic panel. Thank you so much. I have some kind of unformulated questions just from thoughts that I'm having. And I think it's a question that's been percolating for a long time for me, which is, what is it that anti-colonialism wants to abolish, right? What exactly is that? Because I think the way we define the object of abolition, as you put it, Vincent, if I understood you correctly, is going to be critical in the political project, right? And in terms of your presentation, Vanessa, I really heard you say that we have to be both careful about not conflating various forms of domination with one another, because the strategies are very different. But is the project different is there a kind of through line to the abolition of prisons, the abolition of borders, the abolition of child protection services, you know, the whole gambit of things that we need to abolish? What is the through line of all of those forms of domination? And then the second question I had was for you, Vincent, when you said that the imaginative register for anti-colonialism is often what came before it. And I think that that's actually been one of the historical failures of anti-colonial movements, right? Is in some senses, is that imagination of what came before often fails to account for in particular, the class relationships that came before colonialism. Not everywhere, of course, right? But certainly in many of the European colonies, what came before is not anything that we should be calling for a return to, right? So it calls for a different register that is about what some people would call utopia, right? Is calling forward a world that has never existed, right? And one of the things that I'm really focused on is the commons, and the kind of commons that we need today has never existed, right? It's not the commons of the 16th century England, right? It's a different commons, it's a different scale, it's the both there and the here. And so another question I had for Vanessa is, what is the kind of spatial imagination of liberation that people are calling for? Thank you.
So you start with Vanessa to give us a short break.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is, okay, where do I start? Okay, I try to recall how the questions were posed. I think, because I'm a bit confused when I hear abolition as a new term or as a new concept. I think we have to understand abolition as part of the critical genealogy of the development of capitalism from the perspective of the so-called peripheries, but which were actually the center of production. So C.L.R. James is an abolitionist. W.E. Du Bois is an abolitionist, because what they were engaging with, I think, in contrary to rather liberal abolitionists, which were interested in the abolition of enslavement to incorporate the enslaved worker into the relation of wage, radical abolitionists have a different project. And that's what we see with, for instance, many of them being coming from a Marxist tradition, third world Marxist tradition. So I think, and that's something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and many others make very, very clear. We're not talking about a new project here. That's also what she means when she refers to abolition being small c communism. And I think when we look at the tradition of these radical abolitionist scholars, we see that it's not just about one institution like the prison or one institution like the police, but it is about the function. That's why I tried to give this genealogy of policing as a method of capitalism. So when abolitionists, and I'm also critical of that sometimes with regards to folks doing police abolition or only prison abolition, or that to say, okay, there is still a totality that plays a crucial role, and these are, like you said, symptoms. These are methods of that kind of system of exploitation, dispossession, expropriation, and domination. But I do think that the genealogy we're referring to is actually looking at that totality. At the same time, we see that people come to struggle through various crystallization points, right? So when I work with youngsters in the French so-called banlieues, it's hard to organize them around labor because many of them, first of all, are so-called unemployed. 40 to 45% of youth unemployment in the districts I'm talking about, and I'm talking about Western Europe here. So the unmediated way that they experience the capitalist state is through police. And I think that's where you start to organize, right? You start to organize with people where they're at. And maybe that relates to your question of rights also. I do think that rights is always a strategic question, right? With regards to the struggle around the state. Many of these movements have a very strategic approach to rights, knowing that it cannot end there. When the Black Vests say, we don't just want the papers, we want to destroy the system that creates paper. And Nandita was yesterday talking about abolish citizenship with regards to the nation, right? So, or even another form of structural hierarchization, it is a kind of, it's the usual kind of strategic question of, okay, you need to address the state in a certain way, but at the same time think beyond or think through the limits of that kind of addressing, to also think through the limits of kind of, I don't know, incorporation. So yeah, I talked a bit like with regards to the objects, you cannot just bypass the state. So I think the question of, demanding and struggling around the state is something that abolitionists are dealing with, like, for instance, also, I don't know, people calling for higher wages or whatever. So these are kind of steps. And Nandita, with the question to institutions, I think that is something, also I'm very, very thrilled and still energized with regards what happened in the midst of 2020. I think for many of us, coming from the radical tradition of abolition, we were also a bit cautious, right, with regard to not cautious in not terms of being part of organization, but to also discuss what is the limit of a defund approach, right? Specifically, if we think of a global political economy, right? How can you think of is it a universal? Can you make it a universal slogan, right? Or wasn't it be also strategically, in an abolitionist sense, good to claim to link defund struggles to struggles for socialization, I don't know, against mass tax giveaways, bailouts of corporations, etc., right? So you kind of push also into that dimension to also show, okay, it's not just about individual institutions. At the same time, I come back to that, people learn to organize around that kind of immediate or intermediate violence or form of exploitation that they experience, right? And that's, I think, where we can learn a lot from the Panthers or many, many others who actually started engaging with and organizing with the so-called subproletariat on that basis. Also, that's, I think, where experiences is important, but it's never limited to experience, obviously. And I think with regards to the spatial imagination, that's crucial. Like, abolition geography, that's why I was referring also to Kotti für alle. We see that very often in terms of when people seize land to create something different, which is very often not to stay, right? When we think of the encampments, when we think of, I don't know, a blockade, when we think of Oplatz in Berlin, one of the, you had the large march of people rendered refugees and migrants, and created something different, which is never perfect, which is always part of struggle, but that's, I think, the part of where abolition unfolds, not as an utopia, but actually as the trying to create something different in the here and now, and what Gilmore calls life as rehearsal. I think this rehearsal practice is very, very important, the praxeological dimension, which is always spatialized.
Thanks for all those wonderful questions, and thanks, Vanessa, for the history and the radical versus liberal abolitionist tradition. I think that's really, really helpful in thinking about several of these issues. Quickly, to Carlos's question about the Black political tradition. So I think I would not narrate it as redemption focused to abolition focused. I think at every moment in time there's a spectrum of views in Black justice movements, from sort of liberal to radical and anti-capitalist to sort of nationalist, Black nationalist, and the relative prominence of these views is different at different moments in time, and so the abolitionist moment that we're in around now is maybe a different top line story, even as those different tendencies are still all present in various ways, just sort of configured differently sort of under a different narrative. On the question about value judgment and destruction, right, so my point was just that we should be doing the value judging around things like domination or exploitation or whatever sort of meta category like that you want to be animated around, not destruction. So the Gaza case, right? It's colonial domination, for example, or settler colonialism, whatever.
No, it can be destroying terrorism. I want to abolish terrorism from the world as an abolitionist project, to abolish terrorism. And then you define terrorists as you want, you go after them, whoever. Would that be an abolitionist project?
Right. So I think again, I think this is maybe we're rehearsing the argument you had with Carlos yesterday around the sort of performance and posture as bearing content or not bearing content, which we're happy to talk more about. Let's see, going quickly. Oh yeah, the nice question around and forward-looking versus backward-looking imagination. Right. So I mean, my point in my sort of side remark about that was just that we want to sort of imagine the world otherwise, imagine a world without domination. I mean, I think there's a tendency in the social movement space now to always project that into the future, when what we want to do is sort of project it outside of time, right? So it doesn't really matter if it's the forward or back or up or down, right? It's just outside of our present world. And I think particularly in the Black tradition, there's all sorts of really interesting work projecting a past onto Egypt or onto parts of Africa that is imaginative, right? That is kind of in an aesthetic register, and that has a relatively loose relationship to what traditionally trained historian might find, but seems really powerful, right? And so I want to recognize that kind of that kind of imagining that's projected backward as playing an important role here. So Andres has many wonderful questions here, which I'll only very briefly touch on. So the naked. I mean, I think your first question, I think, is exactly what I'm trying to think through. How can we affirm that abolitionism has a negative and a positive dimension, and not tie those too closely together, right? Because that leads us to the problem of deconstruction, where the two are too closely entangled, and you're not getting that destructive destructive force that gives abolitionism its rhetorical and political power, right? In the contemporary social movement context and in the anti-colonial context. A couple of ways to do that. One is to have the positive side be in this imaginative register or aesthetic register, and the negative side be in sort of more prosaic and sort of concrete register. Another way is to focus on the negative side and see the positive side as coming about indirectly, right, through this negative struggle against structures of domination or exploitation. Sort of almost incidentally, one develops these virtues because of the way that struggle works, because of how that struggle works, and that resources that positive side. So that's one example of one way one might go about that direction. So I think there certainly is is a kind of I come from a religious studies context, and there's a kind of faith-based thing going on, a kind of in this abolitionist world, which seems really interesting, right? That there's in the case of all of these sorts of forms of abolition, prison or slavery or colonialism, it's not clear what's going to happen, right? If today we close every prison, right, there will be unanticipated consequences, probably both bad and good, and ones that are maybe huge, maybe small, and yet part of the abolitionist posture is to have a commitment beyond what's predictable, right? To that gesture, right? And part of the sort of spirit of abolitionism is to sort of make plausible that kind of commitment, which sort of gets into this question of the strategic of how to measure success and the sort of logics of failure. I'd actually be curious to hear a bit from Vanessa if we have time as well on. I think your question is really interesting around like if you're failing over and over again, doesn't that create a kind of negative affect? And, I think there's a sense in which if the object is to destroy all forms of domination, right? Of course we'll be failing over and over again, but there are also proximate targets, right? And getting the relationship right, which is kind of a technical question between proximate target and all systems of domination, which are interconnecting and it will never go away because we're in a fallen world or whatever, however you want to sort of characterize it. It seems like something that's being thought about in movement spaces.
Okay, so now we have a next round with Banu, Ida, and Zach.
Thank you. Thank you for a really, really interesting panel. I also have many, many questions, but I will try to discipline myself. My first question is for Vincent. I was really interested in your word choice, posture. Why posture? I'm very curious because to my mind, posture has certain negative connotations. For example, I'm thinking it's more, I understand posture as more of a kind of performance, has a theatrical, public-facing dimension that maybe has an element of artificiality or an assumed nature that is not entirely authentic, that is, playing out a role. And I think, posturing has those connotations maybe more than the word posture itself, but they are obviously very closely tied together. Instead of saying, for example, a stance or beliefs, which suggests a more, a genuine or existentially, present sense of the political views expressed by a person. So I was very curious about that, and I wondered if you intend for those connotations, and if so, what does that do to your relationship to abolitionism? And then I wanna turn to Vanessa's very interesting presentation. I was really curious about this category of the way you use surplus and surplus resistance, which ties very interestingly, I think, to some of the discussions we had about unevenness yesterday. I wanted to ask, how new is this? The category of surplus is new, but I wonder if it's a new way to look at a phenomenon that has always been present, or is it really a new phenomenon for which we need this new conceptual apparatus? And the reason I'm asking this is, to a certain extent, I wonder if all life is not surplus for capitalism. There's a kind of uncontainable vitality of the body, of labor power, the creativity, of working peoples, and their energies that somehow always seems in surplus of what capitalism can exploit and diminish and deplete, thankfully, because otherwise probably not much would be left because of the uncontainable appetite of capital. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Is it an exacerbation of a certain unevenness that we are talking about that then manifests itself in different forms of work, different forms of precarity, different forms of vulnerability, etc.? Or is it something really, really novel that we're talking about? And I was struck by the quotation that you put up toward the end of your presentation by the migrants in Libya. And it seemed to me that, the demands converge around bread and dignity, which is, regardless of, the kind of job and the kind of security that you have, it seems to be a central organizing demand for centuries of struggle. And finally, I think maybe this is a question for both, or just a thought more than a question. I'm really curious why. So to my mind, every revolutionary is an abolitionist. I don't know if every abolitionist today is a revolutionary, but a genuine revolutionary position involves abolition. Maybe not of particular institution. This goes back to what Andreas was saying about the symptom and the cause. But I think the revolutionary tradition has at its center the abolition of inequality and indignity and unfreedom, those three things. And maybe then people can disagree about how those things manifest in particular institutions like the police or the prison. But why today it is this label that captures and captivates the imagination of the new generation rather than, say, revolutionism or anti-colonialism or communism or anarchism or some of the other isms that would. Why is it abolitionism per se? Is there something about that term that has gained a particularly new or different meaning, that is contemporary, that is not existent in the prior organizing frameworks that used to capture radical imaginations?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for two really good presentations. I like these a lot. I think for Vanessa, I'm wondering if you talk a little more about this critical theory of police power that you've developed. So I was thinking about some of the authors that you're referencing here are talking very much about the policing of individuals. And if you think about that, I really like that discussion you had on the moment of fabrication. And so it's not just about a kind of repressive or sovereign power, but fabricating a certain subjectivity. But then I find it really interesting that all three of the cases you drew upon were collective, these kind of collective moments of protest. And I was thinking a lot about, in relation to the politics of encampments now, or say summer 2020, the way that police power didn't seem to have its intended function. That police power seemed to actually actively proliferate protest in a certain way. And so thinking about, in relation to collective articulations of politics, really, what the role of police power is here. I mean, if we think about the kind of function of police power in relation to racial capitalism, but conjuncturally, as you're advocating, what does police power do if not proliferate these kinds of protest movements? And then Vincent, so yeah, I really like this especially the language you use toward the end around abolitionism. But I was wondering if I was thinking about what Banu just said about not all abolitionism being necessarily revolutionary. And so thinking about the ways that, this language of the politics of bearing witness, you said something about that it has a kind of religious aspect to the thing, that it's about conjuring worlds. And so how to avoid a kind of individualized politics of bearing witness? Because abolitionism has always been tied to the development of organization. And so I'm wondering what the relationship is between this kind of politics of bearing witness and how to avoid the almost serializing effect of this politics of bearing witness that individualizes.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very inspiring and politically inspiring panel. And I have some questions thinking in the political praxis specifically. I have been working in an anti-prison organizations for 15 years now in Latin America. We created 3 years ago the first Latin American anti-prison abolitionist network from Argentina to Mexico on the border. And one of the big challenge that we confront from the praxis is that the other very important social movement in many of our countries are the movements against femicide and against disappearance. And many of the feminists that are working, I work also with mothers of disappeared people, so I have like two different political communities that do not share their perspectives. The main slogan of people against femicide and against disappearance is stop impunity. And the other side of impunity is punitivism. So when we say stop impunity, what are we requesting in the streets? So for these movements, to talk about abolition of prisons is a huge challenge. What are you going to do with the femicide? Well, then we have to start, well, first to create a dialogue we have tried, to pluralize justices, to imagine what a feminist justice would look like. But also, I was thinking if some of those terms, because I don't know the context in Germany, are emic or ethic. If those people, like the Black Vest, call themselves abolitionists, or if you are calling their struggle abolitionist. Because in the case of the immigration movement in Mexico, one of the most active ones is the one against the disappearance of migrants, La Caravana Migrante, La Caravana de Madres Migrantes. And even though they are challenging repression against migrants, they talk a lot about rights. So it's the state. They're not abolitioning the state. And they also want to put the people of organized crime and migratory officers on jail. After the 6 massacres that we have, they're struggling to have the perpetrators on jail. So there is not an abolitionist impulse in their struggle for rights. So my question goes, one thing, how do they deal? Is this tension only happening in this context of Latin America where you have different kind of social actors in the streets? Or is there, and also how the concept of abolitionist is used in political struggle? If the people are using that context of, it is you as an analyst that is used in referring to them with this concept. And it is the same thing for the surplus population. If it's your own concept of how people feel when you use it. Because when people talking about necropolitics in Mexico, talk about the bodies in the mass graves as disposable bodies using Judith Butler, the relatives of disappeared were very offended. And we said, well, we're denouncing necropolitics. We're not saying that they're disposable. But they don't like us to use that concept anyway. And thinking, in a Foucauldian way, the productive impact of our academic discourses. How using surplus population as a political concept can have an impact instead of denouncing, reinforcing being surplus population.
Thank you for the question around what is new. I think the production of relative surplus populations as needed for capital accumulation is not new. And I try to, but I think there are new conjunctures that actually allow us to organize not solely around the modalities of exploitation. That's actually the point I find important with regards to surplus people projects. And I will talk a bit about, when I come to your question about that, in terms of what collectors use it, in what kind of way, because many do. And I do think there is a universal tendency to this. We see it with regards to precarity and other notions of, I would say, modalities of disposability. And at the same time, I would be cautious of universalizing it completely, because then I think we would move away a bit from what does it mean to really also wage struggles from the perspective and in close alignment and radical solidarity with the kind of, I don't like this geographic center periphery notion, and it's not really geographic, but this kind of hierarchization, but to really stand in that tradition of the kind of struggle of the super exploited workers, and how would that tradition change how we conceptualize and how we engage in labor struggles. So that's why I wouldn't universalize it completely, but I do agree that there is a kind of, that there are different forms of vulnerability, but all our forms in a differentiated form, like policing, for instance, right? And that's why I gave this kind of part of a genealogy, because sometimes these kind of reductive understandings of policing, you had slave patrols and then you had police, you know, like that kind. No, there's a specific development of policing in relation to the development of global capitalism. Also, policing always functioned alongside differential modes. These modes do not respond to because that group is black or because that group is brown, but it is actually the modality of the hierarchization of exploitation that that is part of the notion of policing here, right? So, and that's why I find Neocleo's work crucial, because, like you said, he really engages with the activating force of police, to understand police, and I think we can make a similar argument around borders, not just as something that repressive movements, but that plays a role in the kind of management of mobile labor forces. Or with regard to policing, with the recruiting into a workforce, but in hierarchized modes of exploitation. And at the same time, I think it's important to really be attentive to that shift of, okay, now it is still about, you know, I don't know, repressing a strike, activating a societal order, reactivating a societal order, and at the same time increasingly managing people that are rendered surplus. Like nobody lives surplus, like nobody's born a refugee, nobody's born a migrant. These are like similar, nobody's born surplus, but is rendered through socioeconomic conditions and processes. And I think we have to attend a bit to the changing, shifting functions of policing. And I think, obviously, that's why, to me, policing the crisis is so crucial, because it shows that shift, right? Very, very strongly with regards to what we can call a security fix. I mean, Gilmore refers to the prison fix. I think in Europe, it's not just a prison, it's a securitization complex, a security fix that is mainly also concentrating around border imperialism, detention centers, and what have you. Prison plays a role in this, yes, but I think there's a whole range of geographies of carcerality. And with regards to the proliferation, if I understood that question correctly, I do think, and that's why I find William Robinson's work really helpful, to really think police still has that function of controlling and repressing the possibility of protest or workers' organization. And at the same time, that also, yeah, like you said, that also proliferates protest, or at the same time, and that what we see constantly in the banlieues, for instance, right? If you have like lethal policing, the people respond and the people defend their dead. Like that's what's happening when 2005, we think of the rebellions in Saint-Denis and other parts. It's also a practice of defense, which very much responds to the all-encompassing force of police power in their lives, right? And this is, I think, also important with regards to a shift. Police does not have the same function as Polizei once did, but I think we see a return of policing in various spheres of civic life as well, right? If we think of the modes of policing in all kinds of some institutions that are maybe rather conceptualized or understood as, I don't know, social institutions, right? So yeah, and with regards to, thank you for these questions. These are particularly around the question of carceral feminism and feminist struggles, but I will answer to the surplus people's ones before. So the concept itself, but I was working around it already, mainly about how people I'm working with as an organizer, but also scholar, describe their conditions. We're not needed anymore. Our parents were needed and broke their backs. We're not needed anymore, right? These are the kind of narratives that a lot of people push, and they understand very much that that's a notion of disposability. Some use the word surplus peoples, like there's, for instance, the Surplus Peoples Project in South Africa, which exists since the 1990s, which was also an inspiration for me, like mainly organizing landless folks. And really having a very, very clear understanding of why it cannot only be questions of exploitation, but yes, also, right? So it's not a either or, it's a both and. And some collectives also work with poor people's approach, right? Like to really, not even workers, but really say, okay, we're poor people. So I think these are all kind of notions that fluctuate, but it is definitely important. That's why I make that point really clear, to say it's not about being superfluous in with regards, but it's regard to how the political economic system operates, and that's why I see that's for me why the resistance of these segments of the global proletariat are so crucial, because that is increasing. So in a way, they have a Vorsprung. In English, that would be, I want to use the word privilege. Yeah, an advantage of analysis and struggle, even with regards to surplus, because that's something that's growing. And I think the movements that refer to it as a self-definition also know that in a way. With regards to abolition, same. Some use the word, others not. Sometimes we find it in their narratives. We want to abolish the system that creates papers, right? So there I'm really also with Gilmore, who says, not every group or network refers to abolition, but when you see what they're doing, that is the dialectic between deconstruction and reconstructing for more livable worlds. That's actually, I think, what some then refers to abolition, other refers of politics of life. I think there are many concepts, but grounded concepts that people use. And with regard maybe briefly to the feminist dimension, so I think here the work of abolitionist feminists is really crucial, because we know we cannot bypass the question of sexualized violence, structural sexualized violence, from on an individual level, community level, but also state level. So I think that's where it cannot just be to say, open the prisons or what have you, but to really kind of work on alternatives. And I think that's the difference also with regards to why abolition now. I think abolition has this notion of not just abolishing something, but establishing and working through and working hard through the alternatives that are maybe also in the experiences of people. So abolition feminism, the work by Gina Dent, Erica Minas, and Angela Davis, I think is really good for that, because it really engages in the feminist tradition of abolition, also with regards to the methods we can use and the alternatives we can draw on, to not say, okay, we're against these forms of state violence, but we will let the formations of violence happen in our communities. We have to address both at the same time. And I think that's why the feminist notion is so important in abolition.
Thanks. I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'll be very, very fast. With respect to Vanya's second question on where does the language or rhetoric of the abolition come from? Yeah, it's an interesting empirical question. I'll just have a speculative answer. I think it has to do something with the Bernie Sanders campaign that sort of captures the revolution language in this provincial world of U.S. politics, right? And then especially Black and brown folks who want to distance themselves from the sort of Bernie Sanders world, which then sort of moves into an extended DSA sort of left world. Want a different sort of organizing framework. At the same time, this prison reform conversation is sort of capturing national media attention, and people want to talk about prisons and not a reform conversation. Abolition provides a framework for doing that. Those two things sort of converge, and then you get a prison abolition and then abolitionism as a sort of freestanding thing. With respect to Zach's question on witnessing, which is really interesting, that sort of, circulation of abolition before the last 15 years was around the death penalty, right? Where witnessing was a sort of central figure around sort of death penalty abolition, and sort of collective stuff was secondary, and it's been a really helpful, I think, shift in the last few years to move from that sole witnessing to the collective that's sort of still happening. I don't have much to say to that beyond that. It seems like there's a role for explicating the discourse, right? That there are new things that are going under the heading of abolition. It's also being used very loosely. So for us in the academy and for those who are sort of organic intellectuals and movements to do some explication. What are the core features of this? How did they hang together? It seems quite timely, and a project that I want to help with, and that sort of centers the collective there. So back to Vanessa's first question. I'm invested in the posture language. It's not incidental. I think performance. I don't take performance to be theatrical or artificial. For Judith Butler reasons, right? That performance seems, central to political life and human life. In this sort of and just a neutral description. I also, for me, posture conjures in this case, sort of putting your hand up and saying no, stop, right? That's the kind of posture that comes to mind for me. It also, I think, connects with this sense of an abomination, which I didn't really unpack here, but when one encounters an abomination, it has a kind of affective, one has an affective response, which seems really central to this kind of abolitionist politics. You encounter slavery and you're sort of appalled. You want to say stop. You want to turn away, but you also want to intervene. That sort of circuit of encounter, affect, response posture strikes me as getting in that. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.